now introduce people very, very briefly. But our first, well, first of all, let me introduce Ipshita, who has been the main coordinator of this entire massive piece of work, who joined us last year in June 2020, deferring going to the US for a master's for a year at least. And Ipshita is a young architect passionate about participatory planning, about engagement, and about the impacts of climate change on urban spaces. With Ipshita this evening, we have Professor Mridula Ramanna, who I think is logging in from Bangalore or Bengaluru. Professor Ramanna is perhaps the finest expert on colonial history of public health in Bombay. And she has written and published extensively, both in books and peer-reviewed articles. Mridula has also been a recipient of the Rockefeller Residency, the Wellcome Trust, and many, many other fellowships over her lifetime. The other speaker who will be in conversation with Ipshita this evening or this morning for her is my very dear friend, Basia Irland. And Basia is I think many of you have heard me say this before, but the inspiration behind the Living Waters Museum and why we started this repository in 2017. I've known her for more than 20 years now, and we've had numerous conversations on water museums around the world and all. So I'm very happy to have you here. I know it's very early in the morning in New Mexico. And Basia has been a professor at the University of New Mexico, where she's taught art through activism. And she's an internationally well-known artist who has done some amazing community projects, both as a sculptor, as an artist, as installations, as combining music and poetry, and all sorts of things. So we're very happy to have this conversation with an academic and an artist, and led by a young budding architect. So Ipshita, over to you, and I'll come back later. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the introductions. I will just share my screen. Confluence, as Sarah mentioned, was actually born during the pandemic, sometime in June 2020, when we were hearing a lot of discourse about how public health and hygiene should be followed in the aftermath of a pandemic. In March 2020, the first case of COVID-19 was detected in Mumbai. The public health discourse and the crisis response that we saw after that was eerily similar to the kind of epidemics that we had seen in the past. The discourse in Mumbai has actually never really taken into account that several of these epidemics and public health crises have been a result of water scarcity or waterborne diseases. Like the curatorial work that happened just before this at 6 o'clock with Abhijit Egbote, there was a clear link between water scarcity and the kind of COVID hotspots that were created in the city. Throughout the pandemic, we have been inundated with information about how the healthcare crisis was to be averted using hand washing and sanitary hygiene. And the dissonance between these narratives and the fact that there was no water in our taps to actually wash our hands every other day was stark. So through this work, we attempted to compile the timeline of waterborne diseases and epidemics in Bombay leading up to the COVID pandemic in order to understand what are the lessons that could have been learned and what are the implications of this in the future. This work was created usually using references by Dr. Ramanna. Her extensive papers on colonial and post-colonial history of public health. The timeline is also interspersed with the works of Basia, whose silk scrolls printed with waterborne diseases across the world add color to what is an otherwise a very grim story. They allow a far more personal inquiry, I feel, into this whole discourse of waterborne diseases and public health. I would like to invite both of them at various places along the walk to give their insights and to tell us a little bit about their experiences while Basia, particularly while creating her book. We begin with the scroll on schistosomiasis, which is one of the oldest known waterborne infestations affecting humankind. In India, the risk of schistosomiasis is magnified in Mumbai and the Konkan coast. Basia, if you would like to talk about how you came to work with these specific silk scrolls displayed here and the process.
Yes, and hi everybody, welcome. In 2008, I received a grant with the chair of biology at the department, the chair of the biology department at the University of New Mexico, to create a video documentary about schistosomiasis entitled Bilharzia Blues, an integrated artistic biological approach to schistosomiasis in Egypt, Ethiopia, and Nepal. The intermediate host for schistosoma flukes are snails, with each parasite attached to its own species of snails. Eggs hatch in fresh water, develop further inside the snails, and then are released back into the water where they invade humans through the skin. Infection of the liver is the most common cause of death. And I might add, we'll see these a little bit later, but I just wanted to add this here, that the scrolls that I created when I was in India were made with sari silk because, and a lot of you know this, of course, the fabric can be folded over many, many times and act as a filter for water. It doesn't necessarily take out the small pathogens, but it can be quite effective of taking out some of the large pathogens.
Thank you, Basia. We have actually divided our timeline into various eras across the years. Each era is dedicated to a specific pathogen or a specific waterborne disease. I'll just highlight a few of these eras, and I hope that you will be able to go through it in detail later. I began the timeline actually in the 1800s because I think there was a certain shift that happened in the public health discourse post 1800s, when actually the subcontinent was ravaged by a series of cholera epidemics. At that time, the popular misconception about diseases was the miasmatic theory, which believed that diseases spread through odor, and that noxious odor that comes through garbage, cesspools, native colonies at certain times. This was further exacerbated by Henry Conybeare's report, who was the sanitation officer at that time. I would like to call upon Dr. Ramanna to shed a little bit of light on this theory of miasma, and what are the kind of changes that happened after Conybeare's report, and what were the shifts in water and sanitary infrastructure that happened post that. Ma'am, you're muted.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Ipshita. Miasma did dominate the colonial public health policy in the 19th century, even though by the end of the 19th century, as you know, as many people know, Robert Koch isolated and identified Vibrio cholerae. And before that, John Snow in London had identified that deficient sanitary arrangements was the cause. But the colonial officials continued to believe in miasma throughout the 19th century. However, sanitary reforms did take off because it was soon realized that, especially with the colonial government, that disease knows no boundaries. You may have a native town and a European town, but disease will not recognize those boundaries. So sanitary reform became very important. And therefore, from the middle of the 19th century in Bombay City, at least, you have sanitary reforms. And the water thing was spoken about by a panelist earlier this week. And but the Indian responses to these reforms were very ambivalent, because some people supported it And in fact, it was funded partly through the municipality where Indians had a representation. But the objection was to tap water and underground drainage because it was ritually polluting, regarded ritually polluting. However, by the end of the 19th century, the peaks of cholera deaths were reached. Of course, they've been linked to famines also, which took place. But gradually, there was a decline in cholera deaths, and it was recognized that adequate water supply was a priority. So that linkage was made. And the same gentleman who had W.J. Moore is the gentleman I'm quoting. He was Surgeon General. By the end of the 19th century, he was able to claim at a conference in London that years ago a writer had said of Bombay, I reckon they walk in charnel houses in 500, 100 will not survive. Now, Bombay, with its copious water supply, extensive drainage, sewerage, and able health officer, is perhaps the most salubrious of tropical cities. There's no doubt that, you know, climate and environment played a very important role in the etiology of most diseases in the colonial perception till the end of the 19th century. But by the early 20th century, it was only a small minority of IMS, Indian Medical Service men, who saw cholera, malaria, or even enteric fever as being caused by meteorological factors. Diseases like malaria and plague were seen to depend more indirectly on climatic factors when these affected the distribution and vitality of pathogens and vectors. Nevertheless, with all diseases, there was a tendency among the colonial authorities to blame Indian habits and customs. And, you know, they had also a superior conception of their hygiene and sanitation. So by the advent of the 20th century, actually bacteriology replaced the miasmatic and contagionist explanations of disease. So I guess that would answer your question, Ipshita.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would also like to reiterate that in 1860, the first the Bihar Lake was created. The first piped water system was reached Mumbai's homes. And I think Dr. Ramanna has also concluded the age of sanitary reforms that I just scrolled through while she was speaking. So we can go to epidemics. Before I do so, actually, I would like to ask Basia to share her experience with Giardia, a disease which is released by cysts that are deposited by beavers in water. So how did being affected by this disease propel you to start this project of the silk scrolls that we are seeing?
Well, for me, it's very, very personal. My investigation into waterborne diseases began when I was diagnosed with Giardia while in Indonesia on a senior Fulbright research grant. It is often referred to as beaver fever because beavers can be carriers of the cyst that discharge into the water to infect people. So I grew up camping in the mountains of Colorado here in the United States, where we sometimes drank directly from mountain streams. And unfortunately, we would no longer consider this, even though the cold, clear streams still look just as clean. So what happened with me was when I was diagnosed, I went over to our medical library and looked at these enormous atlases of waterborne diseases. And it was very interesting to me to see these enlarged and how beautiful they actually were, but they're horrible at the same time. So I'm fascinated by that idea of a terrible beauty. The one that we're seeing here on the left, for example, that scroll, which depicts Giardia, looks kind of like an aerial view, like you're flying over a field. but in fact, it is a skin tissue, a slice of skin tissue that's infected with Giardia. So as an artist, I'm really interested in the visual way that we can communicate these diseases to a broader audience.
Thank you, Basia. I mean, as you said, as they are beautiful, they are terrible, because the age that we reach now is that of the of epidemics. Bombay too faced an epidemic of disastrous proportions in 1896, which was the Bombay plague, when fleas on rats resulted into an onslaught of the bubonic plague. It is said that they actually transmitted when ships used to enter the naval dockyards. And this is also the time that just after the plague, there were many disaster management techniques and public health discourses that were initiated that are actually still followed till date. So I would like to call upon Dr. Ramanna. Could you shed some light on the Epidemic Diseases Act, which was constituted in 1897, and what implications it had? And also the fact that it was used now in 2020 to address the COVID-19 pandemic. And also, how was vaccination at that time perceived? Because I think that was the first time that vaccination came into India.
The Epidemic Diseases Act gave the government the right to inspect public places and homes and isolate anyone suspected of being infected with plague. And it also protected the state and the government officials from any legal actions when they are acting under the Act. So as far, and like, we see today, there were lots of measures which, of course, during the plague, the measures were what was called medical interventionism. They were very drastic: inspection, disinfection, segregation, quarantine, and hospitalization. But its linkage to they have, as you know, in last March, the center advised all the states and union territories to invoke the provisions of Section 2 of the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897. It is aimed at providing for better prevention of the spread of the dangerous epidemic diseases. And this 123-year-old law has come to the rescue of the government in its efforts to tackle the coronavirus challenge, which, as you know, is becoming more and more difficult. Now, Section 2A of this Act actually allows the center to prescribe regulations to inspect any ship or vessel at that time, 1897. Today, the government's decision on restricting international and domestic travel to and from India falls under this Act. The Act also empowers state governments under Section 2(1) to prescribe regulations with respect to any person or group of people to contain the spread of COVID-19. That's how you have those containment zones now. And penalties can be given for violating regulations. They've also used the Disaster Management Act of 2005, which was enacted to tackle disasters at both central and state government levels. And they have termed COVID-19 as a notified disaster, a critical medical condition or pandemic situation. And this has enabled the center and the states to get access to the National Disaster Response Fund, the State Disaster Response Fund, and so on. And they, as you may have also seen, now and then they also impose Section 144 to prevent people from gathering. This is in order to contain the disease. Now, as for vaccination, if I may make a correction, smallpox vaccination was promoted even in the 19th century. And by and large, people accepted smallpox, though there too, vaccination, there too, there were hesitations. But during the plague, there was an urgency, like there has been now, to develop a prophylactic. And Hafkin, after whom Hafkin Institute is named, developed the prophylactic, and they promoted it. It was not made compulsory, but it was promoted. And there were mixed responses. Like today, there are rumors about the dangers of vaccination and so on. Even at that time, there were rumors that there would be weakness in the limbs and pains in the joints, and it is associated with leprosy and fever and so on. But by and large, gradually, people began to accept this prophylactic. And my research has shown that doctors, Indian doctors, civic leaders like Sir Firozshah Mehta and others, Tilak, Gokhale, even Lord Curzon, and took the vaccine. So that is perhaps that answers your question. And if I can take just another minute, I would like to just tell the audience that, the smallpox vaccination was made compulsory in Bombay City in 1877 for children. And then when they wanted to extend it to the whole presidency, there were objections. And the objections were because the objections were to the arm-to-arm method, because, they would take the thing from the child who had already been vaccinated and inject it into another child. So that was what they objected to. And they preferred calf vaccine, the vaccine taken from the calf. Anyway, I think that answers your question about vax hesitancy. There has been a history of vax hesitancy, which you see even today. Thank you, Ipshita.
And there is a very telling photo actually that we have also used in the timeline, where we can see Hafkin actually testing the vaccine on himself and thus proving that this vaccine is not fatal and convincing others to also take the vaccine. And I think it's eerie that the kind of similarities that something that happened 100 years ago is now repeating history now.
If I may add, he also took a dosage which was 4 times stronger than what was prescribed, because he wanted to prove that it worked. Yeah.
I think we will also now skip ahead to another vector, which was the age of malaria. I think malaria has been a disease that has been going on and off since Mumbai's history, since times immemorable. But before I do that, Basia, I would like to ask you. So you came to India for the first and I think the only time in 2004 and traveled with Dr. Sarah Emma to visit stepwells in Gujarat and Rajasthan. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you found there, what that experience meant, and how did you actually represent some of those waterborne diseases that you found there?
Well, I want to begin, first of all, talking about the image that you see up here, which is guinea worm. The 3-foot-long female, think of that, 3-foot-long worm of the female lives in the subcutaneous connective tissue just below the skin, where its secretions eventually cause a blister to erupt. This is really hard, to talk about for a lot of us, especially like for me, it's morning. I haven't had breakfast yet. So, and for those of you who haven't had dinner yet, this is still, it's really hard, but I do find it really interesting and so important to talk about, because these waterborne diseases infect millions of people around the world and cause a lot of not only medical hardship, but economic hardship. So an infected person will often seek relief from the burning sensation by soaking in water as the worm emerges. Upon contact with water, the blister breaks open and the anterior end of the worm emerges to spew thousands of larvae into the water, where they're eaten by copepods, and the cycle begins anew. So in other words, as this, especially in Africa, this is one of the things that they will do. As the worm begins to emerge, someone will take, like if this pencil, if it were a stick, they would wrap the worm very slowly around this stick in order to help emerge it from the body. It's very long process. It's also very, very painful. And one of the things that I admire a lot is that the Carter Center in Atlanta, which is named after former President Jimmy Carter, has been working for years to try to almost completely eradicate the guinea worm. And they have been very successful with this. They've traveled all over the world. So guinea worm, which used to be very prevalent, is almost now completely eradicated, which is great. So during the trip, which you mentioned, to India to visit our hostess, Sarah, at the end of 2004, we visited many of the architecturally beautiful step wells in Gujarat and Rajasthan, where I suspended and documented the sari silk scrolls with enlarged images of the guinea worm. These ancient water structures used to be one of India's major sources of water, but now, unfortunately, partially due to this worm, the step wells play only a minor role. Because the process of infection cannot be seen, like you can't see these worms swimming along, they're microscopic. Because the process of infection cannot be seen, it is sometimes difficult for people to associate the disease itself with the water source.
I think you also mentioned that partially because of this worm, the step wells now have stopped being used as much, partially because of the waterborne diseases that are there. So,
Yes.
similarly, I think 100 years ago also there was another vector, the female Anopheles mosquito, that actually led to the closure of many shared wells in Bombay. Malaria became one of the major silent killers in the early 1900s, and I think before that as well. And I think an investigation was made into malaria when the colonial administrators realized that several people in the army barracks were also dying because of it. Which is when Dr. C.A. Bentley, who is the officer of public health in the British administration, came out with a report identifying that public wells and tanks, which were to that time actually used as major sources of water, they were the breeding grounds of malaria. And then I would like to actually call upon Dr. Ramanna to now explain what was the aftermath of the Bentley report on all these shared water sources, such as wells and tanks, which were open to air and was claimed as being breeding grounds of malaria.
Thank you, Ipshita, for that question. He had many recommendations, one of which was the covering of wells and the treatment of all pools and puddles with pestarine, filling of hollows and low grounds, and introduction of fish to control mosquito larvae. A special malaria department was created under the supervision of the health officer. And the Bombay government, in fact, sanctioned funding, and the Municipal Act was amended, gave the municipal commissioner enhanced powers for dealing with mosquito breeding grounds, and they took action when municipal action was defied. The Bombay Municipal Corporation at that time gave a sanction of 50,000 rupees for this. And but Bentley said that what was important was to educate the people about the wells and also about quinine. He said it's useless to talk about mosquito nets to the poor. What you had to do is to teach the value of quinine. And he recommended free distribution of quinine by philanthropic agencies. And quinine was actually purchased from Burroughs Wellcome, and it was distributed freely. And every week, cases from all the public and private dispensaries would be collected, spleen census would be done. In fact, Bombay had a fairly successful period when they were able to control it. But the reaction of the people was interesting. There were religious scruples about the covering of the wells because they wanted the wells to be open to the sun. It was well water, not piped water, which was regarded sacred. And therefore, there were objections. But gradually these objections were overcome. And you have many leaders, civic leaders, Jamshedji Jiboy, and many doctors who took the campaign to the public. They had, like today you have PowerPoint presentations, they had lantern slides showing the story of the mosquito and what could happen and so on. And interestingly, every week reports would be sent to the newspapers of wells with larvae. This would be sent so that there was so gradually there seems to have been some success. And there was an imperative need to curb malaria because of the commercial importance of Bombay. So in 1918, in fact, they were so successful, they abolished the malaria department. But again, malaria reappeared in the docks. 40 commercial houses sent a petition to the BMC drawing attention to this situation, and the malaria department was reconstituted in 1923. And it was only after 1925 that there was a decline. And as you know, even today, there are periodic actions taken by the municipality, especially during the rainy season, because you also have the danger of that leptospirosis, during the rainy season. Sorry, the voice is breaking. Does that answer your question, Ipshita?
Yes, and we also have this interesting piece of statistics that says that by 1940s, of 4,000 wells, only 1,200 remained open. And I think recently also now there is a move because the city is again facing water scarcity to reopen some of these wells, the ones that they were covered before. So this is something that the corporation is now doing to meet the water needs of people.
If I may just add, they did have a compromise about these wells. They said we'll have trap doors so that, they are, so that when you need to, you open the trap door. That was, but the more important problem was the cisterns in the mills. They had to deal with those cisterns where water was stored.
I think, and the impact of this has been that several of our tanks have also been, our open water tanks have been now filled up. Several wells that were shared water resources have also been covered or filled up in certain cases. And now the reliance on piped water systems is much more.
Yes.
Which is also a problem because modernity has actually brought modern problems. So since our independence and since 1960s, there has been a greater, from our research, we know that there has been a greater private investment in healthcare and several healthcare schemes that have been started, increase in the number of hospitals, and yet public healthcare has not improved. So in 2013, there was a private study by Eureka Forbes, which found that 83% of all diseases in Mumbai are waterborne. And this was personally an eye-opener to me, because I did not know that the percentage of waterborne diseases are so high. By 2020, several NGOs had also published reports saying that Mumbai's healthcare was disastrous. The kind of sanitation infrastructure also that we have at this point, where we have dirty public toilets, several diseases like Yersinia, Escherichia coli, entamoeba, all of these also kind of transmit through these dirty sanitation infrastructure. And just in 2020, when we were thinking that we were reaching a tipping point, the first case of COVID-19 was detected. And a year on now, we realize that there is another surge that is coming. So I would like to now ask invite Sarah, Dr. Sarah Emma, to take the conversation forward.
Great. Thank you very much, Ipshita, for this very insightful timeline and overview and the conversation with our two experts this evening. I just have a couple of questions, and then I think there are questions in the chat box, which Ipshita, you can read after open up to the audience. But just two questions in summary, one for each of you. Mridula, I was wondering, since the kind of discourse on public health that we've seen in this colonial and post-colonial history has been a very top-down one, with the state actually being the main player, leading most of the interventions, the various acts, the Epidemic Act, the whole research around vaccination, etc. So I want to know from you, what role did communities and community-based organizations, civil society, etc., have in terms of healthcare? And perhaps you could use the Spanish influenza as a context to describe some of the interventions that people themselves were doing, because we saw that happening very much in the first few months of the lockdown and the COVID. It was really people-led interventions. Go ahead, Mridula, you need to, unmute yourself,
Thank you. As far as the influence of 1918 was concerned, you know, the government, contrary to what you had just said, did not intervene very actively at that point, because they'd been very chastened by the intervention during the plague. And secondly, unlike plague and cholera, both of which came from the east to menace the west, influenza came from the west. And they too didn't know what it was. It was a viral disease whose causative agent was impossible to detect at that time, even under a microscope. It was not fully identified till 1933. And India's expertise in medical science had grown enormously since the 1890s, but mostly in parasitology and bacteriology, not virology. So, you know, the laboratory research was, of course, initially misled into believing that influenza had a bacteriological origin. Now, my research has been mainly on Bombay City and the presidency and the response to the pandemic. And what I saw was that it was the community, what you are talking about, who actually came to the rescue of people. The BMC did have a medical subcommittee and so on. And you know, at the time of the pandemic, there was also a failure of the southwest monsoon, migrants coming into Bombay City, rise in prices, so many other issues. But yes, you're right. While the BMC formed a medical subcommittee, you had voluntary effort, which I thought was fantastic, because you had people, the Social Service League, they set up an influenza relief committee, and they were able to get funds from the leading magnates of Bombay, the Vadias, the Tatas, Richardson Crudas, and even associations like Cotton Brokers Association, Cotton Merchants Association. Temporary hospitals were set up for castes and communities. This was something which had begun even during the plague, to enable people to overcome their reservations about going to hospitals. They were specially organized for. And you also had, you know, what you would call neighborhood organizations. I've got a whole list of them. Caste and community organizations, youth organizations, even political groups like the Home Rule League, Temperance Association, and so on and so forth. I don't want to give the whole list, but I found that this was a fantastic example. And you know, strangely, even in Ahmedabad, the Gujarat Sabha was the one which took up the relief to the influenza. So I guess that particular example is what comes into mind when you draw the comparison with, you know, the initial reaction.
Yes, with the initial few months of the pandemic. Yes, of course. I think there will be more questions for you in the chat box. Basia, I want to ask you, and I know you've talked about this a little bit and you have some other things to show us this evening. But from your own work, and what is the role of artists in communicating risk, whether it is the risk of public health, the risk of water security, climate change? Your own work, I know, has been a testament to this, and sometimes it must be very difficult. And I know that you have gone into many communities which have been affected by waterborne infections in Canada, in the US, and in other parts of the world. And you've used art as a means of communication, of strategizing, of acting on this, and making people think about the role that they as individuals, their agency, and I think that's the kind of juxtaposition I'm trying to pitch, between the state and institutional frameworks, and then art and agency. So I'll leave it open to you, Basia.
Of course, that's a huge question that if we had 10 hours, maybe I could even begin to answer, but I'm just going to kind of divert it back to one particular idea. So in addition to the visual arts, another important way to communicate information is through music, as you all have been doing throughout your programming, which I have loved. I just love hearing the songs. In Egypt, Ethiopia, and Nepal, I worked with musicians who wrote songs about how to avoid contracting schistosomiasis. These were then sung in local communities in their regional language. So it was much more effective than, say, putting up a poster. If the people weren't able to read, everyone everywhere in the world loves music, and it's a great way to communicate ideas. So I want to just really quickly tell you about another project that I did that relates directly and has affected all of us this past year with COVID. I painted winged boats flying over water onto bamboo leaves as a way to honor those who had died. It is entitled Epidemic Elegy, and I did many, many of these. So let me just see if you can see those.
Yeah, we can. We can.
Here. So I'll just show you just a few of these so you get an idea of how these were done. This came about for me on a very personal level. The first person that I knew personally who had died of COVID was the former governor of the Pueblo of Zia, which is one of we have 19 indigenous tribes along the Rio Grande here. And he was a close friend and a strong water advocate. And that affected me very deeply. So the first one of these that I did was to honor him. And then it became something that felt kind of cleansing for me to do. I would often be crying as I was working on these. But I do think that I work with scientists all over the world, and we often have these discussions about how to bring the arts and the sciences together in the work that we're doing. Like the work that I was doing with schistosomiasis, I was often over in the lab here on campus, which is a schistosomiasis lab. And it's really difficult for me as an artist to understand the life cycle of the schistosome. But the two of us had a goal together to help educate people about this really deadly waterborne disease. And so we could come at it in very different ways, but with the same goal in mind. So I love working with scientists everywhere. So, and I just deeply appreciate all of you that are here right now. I see Hugo is raising his hand.
Right. So,
and you had a question. You had a question about beavers.
I'm going to.
And Sarah, could I please continue with a question?
Yes, of course. I'm just trying to get back to my gallery view so I can see everyone. Okay.
Yes.
So, maybe.
I find it quite intriguing the following. in the Netherlands, we now have a lively discussion about where this COVID infections come from. Is it the punishment of the gods? In our traditional belief, the Christian belief, there is a group of people saying it's a punishment and we have to accept it. But then, of course, we reply that science has also been given to us by the gods. And even the artists have been given to us by the gods to communicate the message of science. So, but still there is a very tough group of people that decline to accept that solutions are also provided for by the gods, the same gods that gave us the problems. So how do you deal with that sort of communal discussions? We find it so difficult here in the Netherlands. How is that in your culture, for example, in India? How is that in the United States, Basia?
I'm going to let you answer, Basia.
Thank you. I can't answer that exact question because I haven't personally run into that, but certainly here in the United States, as you all know, unfortunately, we have a huge problem with anti-vaxxers, people who don't want to get vaccinated. We have a huge problem with people not understanding the science behind COVID, and that's really difficult. So they're very entrenched in their ideas. And there's almost no way, no matter what I would do or what I would say, that I could even begin to, convince people about the seriousness of this. But again, all any of us can do is what we do on a small level and hope that it will somehow communicate to other people. And yeah. Can I answer your other question, Hugo, that you wrote in the chat box, which was about beavers? Yes. I have no idea how to answer that, but I do know how incredibly important beavers are to riparian ecosystems. And so it's a very interesting question that I had never thought about, is because here in New Mexico also, we are introducing both otters and beavers. And, they're very, very important species. So I think it's important to go ahead with those because of all the benefits that they give. I don't know, there must be some way, and I can talk with the chair of our biology department who specializes in some of these diseases and ask him what he would think about, like maybe there's a way even to inoculate beavers. I don't know.
I would think that the reintroduction of extincted species like beavers, the reintroduction is only justified if there is a wonderful, rich, biodiverse habitat available for them.
Yes.
But if they are reintroduced in a monocultural environment, then I think we will face a lot of difficulties with unexpected diseases and outbreaks and processes that are not under control.
Yes, totally. In fact, I was out walking the other day along this canal where there are a lot of beaver dams. Right now, New Mexico is in a very severe drought. And so there was no water in that canal at all. And in the mud, you could see the imprints of the beaver's feet. But where did they go? It's a several miles to the actual Rio Grande. Yeah. So, I think that they had to move their homes in order to find a habitat. So, yeah. And it's good to see.
There's a comment, Basia, from Ishan there for you. Beavers are a keystone species. They shape the environment around them and make a positive impact.
Yes,
including filtering water.
And hi, Ishan. Can everybody put their Video's on.
yes, so we can see you.
Hi, good morning. I'm just waking up, which is why my camera wasn't on. But yeah, I just learned this about beavers in the last few days, so it's interesting we're having this conversation. They're like one of the very few keystone species on Earth. It's them, elephants, some types of ants, but they have a big enough impact on the environment around them to, be called that and to markedly like change what the environment around them looks like for other species. It's really fascinating. Yes.
Okay, I'll have to veer the discussion a little bit from animals and beavers to public health, but and COVID a bit, and all the other waterborne things we've been talking about. But I'm great to see the interaction with the natural and animal world and the human world. Are there other questions for Professor Ramanna or Basia right now? Ipshita, do you want to go through any of the chat box questions?
I have a quick question, and I don't see where she is on here. Is Sophie here?
Yes, she is.
Yes. Can everybody put their video on so that we can see people? If you would, because Sophie was saying that she had actually witnessed somebody with a stick removing one of the guinea worms. Yeah. And I just wanted to find out, was she in India when that was happening?
Yeah. Can I say something then, Basia?
Yes.
It's my brother, younger brother, very young in those days, an adolescent, teenager. He had guinea worms, and I saw my mother taking a matchstick and very gently wrapping the guinea worm on the matchstick. I wanted to share that with you when you talked about, and I knew it was coming when you spoke about the wrapping. I knew it was coming, and I could visualize the guinea worm. Yeah, Basia. Can you see me, Basia?
No,
welcome.
It's not on.
Welcome to India.
Thank you.
There's
other questions, comments?
There are several comments by Rosama. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong.
Rosama, do you want to say something? I know you're on the screen somewhere. And someone's talked about beavers being used for fishing. Sukrit.
Yeah.
But you sent it to everyone in the waiting room.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I think Rosama may have left. Oh no, she's here. Rosama, would you like to raise some of your points?
No, they were just, as the conversation was going on, just some things, like the prices of the vaccine set to go up. I just wanted to point people to those. So I posted some things, nothing in particular.
All right. Okay. I'm just looking again. Leprosy. Okay. All right. Anyone else wants to, because I know it's late, and Basia, you haven't had breakfast yet, you said. So I don't want to extend this too long. It's good to see everyone here. If there are any other questions, comments. All right. I know that some of you have been with us in this, joining our programs more or less every evening. I recognize a lot of names here. And I wanted to thank you for being here with us. I wanted to thank our speakers and our experts, Basia and Professor Ramanna, for taking us through this kind of timeline, both with the history and the personal comments and viewpoints that you interspersed in this thing. And of course, Ipshita for hosting and hinging all of this together. I don't know how many of our partners are online, but I had asked Sukrit if you could just pull up that last slide of the contributors, if that was possible. Otherwise, it's there on the website. But since this is our last event of the launch week, and Confluence has brought together so many people, we wanted to thank all of you that made this virtual exhibition possible. From architects, Rahul, Chembukar, Minaz Ansari, Janisha, Ritu, Deshmukh, from cartoonists, from other kinds of graphic artists, from the Water Environs team, Ajay Nayak, Kimaya, Vikram, the Kohli art community, the Kohli community, and Parag Tando, Aslam and his amazing photography and the story of the Bishtis, the marine environment and their work that they did in making alive our seashores and our underwater world for us. The team from Pani Haq Samiti and all their contributors there, Sitaram Shelar and many people were online yesterday for a very interesting conversation on access and equity issues around water. And then the team, of course, that did the whole culture and faith thing with Janisha and Minaz Ansari. And I hope I've kind of covered. And of course, we had Abhijit on earlier this evening, taking us through a map that showed COVID hotspots in the context of our informal communities, informal settlements, and which were, of course, also settlements where water insecurity was very high. So we've had, and it would be amiss if I didn't thank our amazing design and development team that worked on this website in a record time and that kind of ironed out a lot of glitches for us that kept coming and very, very patiently going back and forth. So I want to especially thank Radhika for what has turned out to be an amazingly classic and beautiful, visually beautiful and stunning website, Radhika Chopra and her team, and the development team at Pi Technologies for all the work that they've done. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this site will be active for 1 year. We will keep it going, and we will be planning future conversations, future exhibitions. Hopefully we can do some live exhibitions as well if the COVID situation eases a little bit by maybe June, July, or maybe after the monsoons. And as Ipshita mentioned, we'd love to take parts of this exhibition to other countries, other places, virtually or otherwise, and to schools and colleges and institutions when they reopen. I can't think of anything else to say. Ipshita, is there something I've forgotten or someone I've forgotten to thank?
Well, I want to thank you, Sarah, and your team for organizing this wonderful week. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Hugo, and all of you who are online, and of course, all my ardent fan of supporters over here. This is, I don't know what else to say.
Sarah, if I may say, I have thoroughly enjoyed this week. Thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing this Living Waters Museum go out to, as you said, schools and colleges. They need to, I think the principal of my college has attended this session, and I'll send the link to her.
Sure, that would be wonderful. You just reminded me, Ramanna, that I thanked everyone else, but I've not thanked my own team. The Living Waters Museum team, from Bhargav, who helped with the tech, to Sukrit, who has been hosting us every night, and of course his music, which many of you heard right in the beginning. Sachi and the social media team that she worked with, Ami Joseph, and Ami has also been a contributor to the exhibition, also Roshali. I don't know that many of these people have been able to be online with us this week. And of course, Ipshita, you have been there right from the beginning, and it's your inspiration that has brought us where we are now. So don't need to thank you again. So yeah, it's been amazing. We will take it ahead. That's what we want to do. We want other organizations to do this. We're already beginning work in other parts of India in other urban waterscapes along similar lines, trying to see whether we can build these kind of partnerships again, linking scientists and artists. And since I am now at the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research in Pune, we have an opportunity to actually work with scientists on some of these topics. So please keep writing in to us with your thoughts and comments and ideas, and we're open to thinking of ways to work together.
Maybe Sarah,
Yes.
I would like to give one more comment and encouragement,
Sure.
please. I think that the idea of a virtual museum is such an innovating concept. By setting that up, you have inspired so many physical museums around the globe that are now facing the lockdown, and they are all working on also a sort of virtual presence,
Right.
like the one in Ireland.
Yes.
And I see it also here in the Netherlands. Physical museums are now working on setting up also a large virtual presence. It is more efficient. It's easier to share materials and concepts and musicological productions. So thank you for pioneering this new way of having a museum.
Okay, I'm going to mute my mother. To mute my mother. But
time to like everyone's online, and if everyone would like to come on camera, it would be a good time to take a little bit of a group snapshot for our social media.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Yes, if you can all unmute your videos and put on that lipstick that you can't wear when you wear a mask anymore, we can then take a picture. Yeah, that would be wonderful. Are you going to do it, Sukrit?
Yes, I'm going to do it. So I'm just waiting
Thomas.
for a few more people.
Hello, Thomas.
Tom, I'm saying.
Thomas, hi.
So I'm just
Hello,
waiting.
Sophie. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well, yeah.
I'll take.
It's so nice to see Basia. I want one of your artworks. I want one of your artworks. I'm not a good artist. And there's Minaz here. Hi, Minaz.
Okay.
Mute
I'm
you.
guessing everyone here who's
Wait a
willing to
moment,
be on
Sukrit.
camera.
Yes.
Increase the tabla. Tabla ka hai?
Snapshot.
Where's your tabla?
Mami Sukrit is taking a picture of all of us.
Okay, so we can smile.
Yeah.
Okay, it's done. Thank you.
Thank you, Sukrit. Take a few so we all smile properly. Great. I can, Sukrit, we still have to share all our chat boxes with everyone concerned. Thank you for all the words of inspiration and support. I'm not really sure whether it's just us that has inspired virtual museums. I think we've been forced into this by the pandemic. But yes, we've, it was always my idea to, Basia, you know this, we talked about a museum in a stepwell. And then we realized we can't close a stepwell, and what would you do in a stepwell? So that was our first plan for a museum in a stepwell. And, but, I think the fact that we are here from so many different parts of the world in a virtual medium is amazing. And I think for many of our events over the past 1 year, we have been able to link across continents and countries in ways that were absolutely not possible unless you spent a huge amount of resources traveling and increased your carbon footprint and your water footprint. So what we're doing is in a virtual way. I hope there are no other costs to this virtual medium, which I don't know about right now, but definitely in terms of environmental costs, I think it's been a great way of working. So look forward to continuing the journey with many of you on board. So thank you, Sukrit and Ipshita, for hosting us this evening. Thank you, Mridula and Basia and Hugo and Thomas and Darab and Ishan for waking up in the morning. and all of you wonderful people, Minaz, and some of you have not unmuted your videos. Okay, and